So thank you very much for everyone coming along today. Actually, I think we have a sort of guest host for you today. Pascal Michael is going to be kind of overseeing this more sort of conversational Q&A type session. We don't have a keynote or a presentation, a formal slideshow or anything like that, but Greg and Pascal have worked together previously and spoken a lot on this subject. So it should be a very interesting conversation, and you're free to ask your own questions as well. Pascal, would you like to introduce yourself and Gregory? Or Gregory, I mean, you can, I'm sure you can do that yourself as well.
Yeah, I can quickly say some words about myself and then hand over to Gregory to do the same. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for a while, actually. So yeah, looking forward to it. So my name's Pascal Michael. I'm a newly minted Doctor of Philosophy, thanks in part to Dr. Gregory Shushan himself. Gregory was my external examiner for my PhD Viva not long ago, some months ago. So my doctorate was in near-death experiences and their interrelationships and intersections with psychedelic experiences, and kind of mainly DMT. And I'm a current lecturer at the University of Greenwich as well, where I research and teach on similar topics, including other more normal psychology and neuroscience related things. And I also teach I co-run a course, an online course with my old supervisor and our colleague, Dr. David Luke, about transpersonal psychology. So that's me.
I'm Gregory Shushan, and my background is history of religions, ancient history, and anthropology, archaeology, that sort of thing, Egyptology. So one of the things that was challenging about being the external examiner for Pascal's thesis was that it was a very different approach. But having said that, he was very much attuned to the methodological and theoretical problems of generalizing too much about near-death experiences or DMT experiences, and sort of had a cultural sensitivity about it. So I think that helped the work a lot, and also helped my ability to engage with it, because it was pretty unfamiliar territory. But I've mostly written on near-death experiences across cultures. My first book was on afterlife beliefs in 6 different ancient civilizations around the world, and the way those beliefs were possibly informed by near-death experiences, and how they were kind of possibly cultural expressions of near-death experiences. And they were mostly completely separate societies. So ancient Egypt, Sumer, which had some connection, but Vedic India, China, and Aztec and Mayan, and I think that's it. So the question being that there was little, if any, contact between most of those civilizations. So any kind of similarities cross-culturally between their afterlife beliefs would have to be explained in some other terms. And so that's where I kind of looked to the near-death experience as a way of explaining that. And then I've also done research on cross-cultural NDEs and small-scale indigenous societies in so Native Americans, Africa, and Pacific Islanders. And that was, again, I kind of looked at before there was any contact between them, and before a lot of missionary or explorer activity, though of course that's where we get our sources. So so there was some kind of cross-contamination between Christianity and these cultures, but it was just, again, kind of looking at looking a little bit more at the individual ways in which near-death experiences were incorporated into different cultures' beliefs and worldviews, essentially. And we actually had more overt descriptions of near-death experiences from these cultures. So those are kind of my two major studies so far. And then I've just recently embarked on a new one on NDEs in classical antiquity, and that's going to be more kind of zooming in on a quite narrow focus. Again, how these experiences were seen, how they were integrated into different myths and ritual practices, or how they were also rejected and ridiculed in certain contexts. So yeah, and I'm also currently, so that project is actually a second PhD with Birmingham Newman University. And then I'm also an adjunct professor at Marian University in the US and Wisconsin, teaching on their thanatology program. And yeah, I think that's probably about it. And then this is kind of Pascal's way of getting revenge on me for grilling him during his Viva. So I'm now in the hot seat.
Yeah, which is a fun way to couch it and advertise it, but it's really by no means true. Like with the Viva was a lot of fun, an academic's way of having fun, and hopefully this will be the same, just in a bit of a role reversal. So Sarah, you want us to just sort of?
Well, I mean, I guess I can start us off, given the fact that we've done a series of talks so far approaching the subject of dreams. And I've hosted Gregory previously on the Egyptology lecture series that I host, Explorers Egyptology, where he spoke about NDEs in the context of afterlife beliefs in Egypt, the journey through the duat, and accounts of that journey, perhaps representing real near-death experiences that people had in those times. And I'm interested to know and to kind of reiterate what you think with regards to the relationship that ancient people perceived about these kind of divine journey dreams and near-death experiences, how those worlds may be perceived to overlap, because you also have that tradition in the Orphic mysteries as well, with the Totten passes, with the golden Orphic tablets of preparation for death being practiced in dreaming states.
Yeah, I think it's clearer in Greece and with the Orphic tablets than in Egypt. I mean, you've had Kasia Spaskowska, right? Speaking, yeah. So she's the person who knows, probably the most about dreams. But as far as like any shamanic sort of component and that overlapping with conceptions of the afterlife, it's pretty difficult in Egypt, I think. I think there's a lot that would be speculative. You do run across a lot of people stating things as if they're fact about Egypt. Like recently, somebody wrote to me and said, asking me about this idea that pharaohs would practice for death in the afterlife by sealing themselves in a tomb in order to have a kind of, bring about an NDE type experience. And, who knows, it could have happened. But as far as I know, I don't think there's any evidence for anything like that. But I think there is a kind of, maybe even a sort of worldwide complex of that sort of phenomena, because it's also present in Tibetan Buddhism, where they explicitly practice lucid dreaming in order to kind of practice for the afterlife and or practice for what is essentially a near-death experience, which they describe very much of those terms. And that's about kind of recognizing the symbols that you're going to see during the dying process, so you can see that it's illusory and that it's the clear light of pure reason, that it's not really an objective personality spirit, it's not a god. And that's, as you recognize these things, then you're able to sort of deal with the different kinds of obstacles and states of mind and threats and temptations that you're going to be encountering in that state, so you can overcome them and get off the cycle of rebirth. In Greece is kind of more of a case of, in the ancient mysteries, there is kind of explicitly stated that those who undergo mystery initiation will have a positive afterlife. They will dwell with the gods or dwell as a god, and those who don't will live in the mud, I think is one of the quotations. So it was practicing for a positive afterlife, I think, going through the kind of mystery initiation, which involved probably altered states of consciousness. Certainly altered states of consciousness. How they achieved it, we don't know the degree to which they used hallucinogens or whatever, but the disorientation of entering into a cave and going through these religious rituals with the idea planted in their minds that they're going to have this certain kind of experience and that it's related to an afterlife. I think it's a very similar kind of analogous kind of structural experience in a way. So, and I also think it's related to, I was just thinking about this the other day, in fact, the whole principle of sympathetic magic, where you affect one thing in the hopes of it's going to affect another. And the most kind of obvious basic example of that is a voodoo doll, where you stab a pin into a doll of Donald Trump or whatever, and he's in Washington, he's going to start screaming. But I think in some sense, this is comparable to the mystery initiation practicing of a near-death experience or of the dying process, because what you're doing in that cave and what you're doing through that initiation experience is objectively going to affect the kind of experience you're going to have when you die, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me the role that memory seems to play in these things as well. This understanding of memory being a kind of divine art form in some ways, like the role of oh yeah, she's not called Mnemosyne, she's called Mnemosyne is the correct pronunciation. Like the role of memory in the Orphic Mysteries, for example, so that you remember to kind of maintain perhaps that thread of consciousness when you're entering death, and this conception of the afterlife being the same realm that you visit in dreams. And so if you consider, if a society, a culture conceptualizes the dreaming as the same place that you visit when you die, then it's something separate from you as an individual, and so therefore your ideas and feelings about death and dreaming are going to be very different. The same as in Egypt, how nightmares were considered to be personified beings that could come upon you in the night. So obviously nightmares would be that much more terrifying if you don't think they're just regurgitations of horror films that you've recently watched, for example. So it's interesting to me how different dreaming could have been experienced in the ancient world if they viewed it as something like seeing into some other world, or some sentient being able to influence you while you were sleeping, and you being the vulnerable sleeper that the dream is coming upon.
Yeah, for sure. Although I think there's also, I'm always wary of overgeneralizing too much, because when you look at dream interpretation texts with going back to ancient Near East, but also like Artemidorus and things like that, that to me shows an awareness, or at least possibly hints at an awareness that those aren't actually real states, that they're not places that the consciousness is actually going to, that they're symbols to be interpreted. And they interpreted them in very different ways than, Freud or Jung or whoever would, or how we would personally. But they were still, seen as, more like an illusory sort of state of being that you learn something from, rather than that was really a place you went to. So about your teeth falling out or whatever. So
I mean, I guess with most ancient dream interpretation, it relies upon wordplay and homophones, and so it's related to language quite often. So it's interesting that you have that aspect of dream interpretation, and yet you have this idea that a nightmare can be a demon that has its kind of own volition. Yeah,
and I think that really reflects the different, just the diversity of thought, really, I think, in the ancient world, just as there is now.
So do you have like a favorite example of a very convincing report of a near-death experience from Greece or Egypt?
Yeah, I just happened to. There's a few. Well, the myth of Ur is the most famous one, and that's reported by Plato. I won't go into that one. It's really, really long. There's endless debate about whether it really is an NDE. It's full of obviously super encultured kind of descriptions of what the afterlife is like, and is very much used by Plato in service of just kind of didactically explaining his theories about the soul and justice and the afterlife and things like that.
One thing though, Gregory, sorry that I know you didn't want to like elaborate too much on but one thing I remembered about that is that he also describes, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember he describes a spinning wheel.
Yeah.
But that was really interesting to me because there actually are other cases of more like contemporary near-death experiences where they do describe some kind of, it's a wheel-like structure but of a metaphysical nature, and maybe associated with samsara and or at least the concepts of samsara and reincarnatory mechanisms and things like that. And that's intriguing because this wheel motif is actually quite a trope in certain psychoactive substances, like especially salvia. I mean, with these things, like, you know, they can be memeified in a way, but there's certainly a sort of a stereotypic trope with salvia, with this wheel. And salvia was also actually the phenomenology of it in a particular study was quite tightly associated with near-death experiences. So, but I don't remember like the details, especially of what happened with and the wheel. Do you remember, or do you have any like comments on that?
Yeah, that is a really interesting one. He called it the spindle of necessity, and it was basically his revelation in his experience of the workings of the universe, the kind of mechanism behind what makes the whole universe function, which is interesting because that's, you know, that specific thing is, you know, you don't really run across that very often in NDEs, but you do run across the kind of transcendent knowledge. So if you look at it in a just what the theme is, you know, what kind of experience that is, and it's one of this experience of the unity of the cosmos or the workings of the cosmos. But it's interesting that there's also there's obviously the wheel of Ezekiel, which people have talked about in those terms, and it's also kind of evokes the vortex of a near-death experience. If you think about the tunnel, about going through the tunnel, I mean, he didn't go through this spindle, but it's a sort of whirling, circular shaped experience. But then there's also, just going to look at my notes here, because there was another one from Greece. Yeah, Thespesius of Soli, sometime after 81 CE, during his NDE, he saw, let's see, bubbles that were breaking insensibly and by degrees, and his soul came forth in the shapes of men and women, or souls came forth to him in the shapes of men and women, light and nimble, as if being discharged of all of their earthly substance. They differed in their motions. Some leapt forward with a wonderful swiftness. Others were like so many spindles of spinning wheels, turning round and around, sometimes whisking upwards and sometimes darting downwards. So again, it's a pretty different description of a wheeling, spinning kind of thing. But just the fact that symbol. Sorry?
Just seems like that sounded a bit more Ezekiel-esque, actually, though.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some kind of whirling, spinning trope going on. There's a really great book by Yulia Ustinova called it's about caves in ancient Greece, caves in the ancient Greek mind, and she talks about that spinning thing in relation not only to near-death experience vortices, but also to caves, and just the idea of descending into a cave, which is such a prominent thing in Greek ritual and myth and everything.
Is that something? Is that the kind of thing that may have occurred somewhere like the cave of Trophonius? Do you think this
yes
kind of orientation and then visualizations?
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, one of the examples I have is really interesting. Let's see, hang on one second. I don't have this stuff memorized at all, so I need to be looking at notes. So this is interesting, not only on the level of caves, but also on the idea of just how near-death experiences were incorporated into culture and mythologized in a really, what I think is a quite obvious way. So during the Roman Civil War in Sicily, this is around 40 BCE, in Julius Caesar's navy, there was a Roman soldier named Gabinius or Gabinius. And he had an NDE under pretty gruesome circumstances. He was taken prisoner by Sextus Pompeius, and he ordered that Gabinius's throat was cut. And they were so enthusiastic about this, the soldiers, that they practically severed his head from his body. And he lay there on the seashore for the whole day, slowly dying. And the reason I think they tell you these gruesome details is to reinforce the fact that he really was dead. A lot of these accounts really want to stress that to enhance the kind of miraculous claims that are involved in it, to validate what they ultimately say. So so towards the evening, he's lying there on the shore, and he's groaning, and he begged the crowds who had assembled to go get Pompeius and tell him to come to him, because he has something to tell him. He has a message from the underworld. So he says he had just received from the souls below, and he had this important news to communicate. And Pompeius, he doesn't go himself, but he sends some friends. And Gabinius states that the good cause and the virtuous partisans of Pompeius were well pleasing to the infernal deities, and that the outcome of the war would shortly prove as he wished. He had been ordered to announce to this effect to Pompeius, and that as proof of the truthfulness, he himself would expire the very moment he had fulfilled his commission, and his death actually did take place. So basically what happened was he gets killed by these soldiers. While he's dying, his soul goes to the underworld, and souls there give him information about how the war is going to go, that he's going to be victorious, and also that as proof, I'm going to die. So he basically predicted his own death, which is not really much of a prediction, considering that he's lying there with his throat cut. But the interesting thing about this, it's a very short account, but to me it's unambiguously an NDE, just because it's supposedly factual. The guy is dying, and he goes to the other world and comes back with a message. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us anything about what the underworld's like, or a tunnel experience, or a life review, or anything. But at least we have what we do have. But what's really interesting about it to me is there's a poem by an epic poem called the Pharsalia by Lucan, and it deals with actually the very same war. And it tells of how Pompey's son, Sextus, goes and seeks out a witch, and the witch is named Erichtho. And he wants to find this witch so that she can tell him the future about certain events of this very same war. So the way she brings about this prophecy about the war is she goes to a cave, and she resurrects a dead soldier who's not named Gabinius, unfortunately, but to me it's very clearly based on the same story. So she's able to see his ghost sort of hovering next to his corpse, and the wound on the body was evident, and it was obvious that he was killed. And what the text says was, the gift supreme of death was now being deprived of him. And there's a very kind of lurid description of Erichtho getting a snake and whipping the corpse, which brings it back to life. And so he leaps up with his eyes blazing in fury. It says, amazement seized upon him, to the earth brought back again. So then he was initially unable to speak, and it took a minute for her to be able to give him the power of speech. And then when he comes back and he is able to speak finally, he says he's been culled from the margin of the silent stream. And he tells of how even in the realms of the underworld, there's discord among the souls of the dead because of this war. And that even these poor otherwise blissful ghosts are now filled with sorrow. He then predicts that Pompey is going to be defeated and Caesar assassinated. And his message is that despite the suffering and all the war, that peace will eventually be found, but only in the afterlife. So he says the battle settles nothing but your burial place. So he's not just giving practical information about the war that he's predicting. He's giving a kind of more metaphysical and also existential statement that, regardless of how you're going to kill yourself, you're still all going to be coming into the afterlife, and that's the only place you're going to find peace. So I think that this has got to be a case of that NDEs having survived into some kind of oral legend in the popular imagination, and then Lucan elaborating upon it in the creation of his epic poem of this. And rather than the person having a spontaneous NDE and coming back to life, he had to kind of bring in this more dramatic trope of bringing the corpse back to life and whipping it with a snake until it gives them the information they want. So yeah, it's just an interesting idea of how an NDE, I think, which was probably a factual one, was mythologized and worked into a literary text.
Which in a way is kind of quite, I mean, that's so fascinating. That mirrors the sort of general idea that you're kind of promulgating about like NDEs being some kind of primary type experience, which then leaks into and drives not just like beliefs very specifically about the afterlife, but kind of cultural beliefs and culture itself, which then kind of gives birth to religion and other metaphysical kind of ideas.
Yeah, that's what David Hufford called the experiential source hypothesis.
Yeah,
which I think is a handy term.
But it's interesting to see it like weave its way in through fiction, like through this like ancient Greek like epic poem, which is something that like Jeff Kripal, for instance, talks about people having like creatives having experiences like out of the ordinary experiences, and then writing themselves and their experiences like into these almost kind of semi-autobiographic kind of works of fiction, but then it has this kind of constant positive feedback effect of then that itself informing experience, which is so via fiction, let's say, or art, it's sort of mirroring some of the things that you're kind of propounding about there being a primary experience and then that driving belief, but then there's going to inevitably be the constructivist component of belief then driving experience. And
yeah, absolutely. And it's a good point that it's not just in religion, it's in popular culture and just the general popular imagination. There's a really interesting satirical account. Let me see if I can find that one quickly. Let's see, 1 second. Yeah, I'm not finding it at the moment, but basically it's in I can't even remember who wrote the text at the moment off the top of my head, but it's in a discussion, a literary text where they're discussing philosophers are sitting around discussing basically strange phenomena in religion and gullibility and things like that. And one of them is saying, this amazing thing happened. The goddess Astarte was walking down the road from the sea, and she was 30 stories high, and she was throwing people into a chasm of hell. And it's really kind of colorful, quite bizarre description. And another philosopher says, yes, I have a similar story. This was equally bizarre. And he basically just relates a near-death experience, which is not really that bizarre. But the idea was in that text was to show like people who actually believe in these crazy experiences like NDEs are just as bad as somebody who believes in this 200-foot goddess striding along the coast. And again, kind of just revealing the really broad diversity of the way these experiences were processed even within single cultures, because we've got the Orphic tablets, which seem to be, they're like sort of guidebooks to the afterlife, which have a lot of NDE type content, and they show that they were obviously taken seriously. And then the mystery cults, which seem to be replicating near-death experience in order to bring about a positive afterlife. And then you've got these satirical kind of accounts and literary accounts. So yeah, I think to me, it's almost a case of, people are people, whatever culture and era you live in. And it's just the same way it is now. You've got people who are super hostile to this kind of thing, and you've got people who are uncritically accept them.
What about the influence that real near-death experiences may have had on oracles of the dead? For example, at somewhere like Bayer, where they were kind of reenacting a journey across the River Styx and communicating with beings in the underworld to kind of, I guess, find out secrets, like it was about prophecy and divination. But there certainly seemed to be people that were experienced in pushing towards that liminal zone between life and death, like consciously, perhaps through dream practices, through using other psychoactives, going on that journey, acknowledging that there are some sort of way markers along the way, and then recounting and telling people what kinds of things people might prepare themselves for once they start embarking upon that journey towards the afterlife.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things NDEs did, it might not be the NDE itself that's important, but yeah, as you said, it kind of indicated a certain kind of other reality that might be accessible by various sorts of beings. So if people have proof that there are these spirits in the underworld because near-death experiences are telling them, and near-death experiences are likely to be believed because if everyone thinks that they really were dead, then they would have privileged information for, having gone there and come back. So if they come back and tell us that those kinds of spirits are there, there's not probably a lot of people who want to facilitate a near-death state in themselves in order to reach them. So yeah, they come up with other ways to interact with those spirits in other worlds through oracles of the dead, and I think that's what the account in the Pharsalia was talking about as well. This kind of a crossover experience that draws together a sort of near-death experience and an oracle of the dead through the witch bringing the soldier back to life. But what you said earlier, Sarah, about memory, I thought was interesting. It just had the thought that you would think that because of the focus on that and the importance of essentially consciously dying in a lucid dream type state, that there would be examples of life reviews in some of these ancient Greek NDEs, and I haven't found any so far. And that's something that we talked about in Pascal's Viva as well, this really interesting absence of life reviews in NDEs, and that they seem to have a kind of much greater significance in the popular imagination about what NDEs are than is actually reflected in reality. I think there's something about them that is really evocative to people, and it's really amazing to think of your life flashing before your eyes in just a few seconds or a few minutes, and that you feel all the emotions of everybody you've affected in your life, and it's a kind of self-judgment type thing. But it's actually pretty rare, even in Western accounts. It's rarer than we would think, even though it's most prominent in Western accounts. But in small scale societies, there are hardly any. And yeah, so far in Greece and Rome, I haven't found any.
But I guess
there's different.
Sorry.
There's different kind of criteria for what you could define a life review as. So got a couple of reflections on that. I mean, yeah, so this idea that life reviews might be not occurring or far less common in small scale societies and business sizes, and are more common in Western, but perhaps not to the extent that they seem to be popularized as. And I think maybe this is something I heard from you, Gregory, some time ago about in these indigenous or small scale societies, that is the idea that dying is actually about everyone. So so you can think of them being individualistic or collectivist or whatever, but even in the domain of dying, of what death is and represents, it's fundamentally a shared experience, which kind of is fascinating given the kind of possible parapsychological connotations of that, kind of echoing what I wrote about morphic resonance in my discussion chapter, which you might remember, and then which that itself kind of echoes what you were saying about this, which is fascinating, the sympathetic magic idea of there being some kind of non-locality to the kind of death experience. But aside from that, so even though there might not be a life review like proper, or like life review as we come to think of it in these other societies, there's still a there's, and you've argued this, like there's still this evaluative element to it. So they might not be seeing their lives, but there's still a kind of a judgment from maybe usually another entity. But even if that weren't the case, because lots of people are fascinated with the life review, and David Lorimer wrote Hole in One, which is like all about that, and he referred to it as empathic resonance. So even if we think about the life review as an individualistic thing, there's still this idea of you seeing your effects on other people through their own eyes. So that in itself is kind of non-individualistic, is actually kind of maybe intrinsically collectivist. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. So yeah, there's probably one of the most common things about NDEs anywhere is that you come back as you come back a transformed person and a better person, and with a more spiritual focus, a desire to help other people, being less selfless, philanthropic. So in a sense that plays into it. And a lot of the accounts in Native Americans and the Pacific, it's bringing back a certain kind of knowledge which will help the society, whether it's like, here's a certain plant that you can find which will help cure the current plague that's happening. So yeah, that's kind of thematically linked to the positive transformational effect, and the I guess an introspective thing about how we can better society, and maybe better ourselves as a way to better society. There's a real dynamic in a lot of these societies of people who have NDEs becoming prophets by virtue of their NDE. So they're seen as kind of leaders of a new religious movement, which is all tied in with cultural regeneration and religious revitalization movements. So yeah, I agree with you about all that thematically, but the panoramic life review, I think, is kind of the sticking point, and especially when it comes to contemporary materialist scientific explanations of the NDE. There, and this seems to happen every few months. There's a new study coming out where scientists say either they're saying they've explained the NDE full stop by a burst of brain activity at the moment of death. More often, it seems to be they've explained the life review through this burst of brain activity, and they've found it in rats, and now they've found it in humans on a couple of different studies. So for me, the issue, the sticking point about the life review is, if there's supposed to be this panoramic life review experience that's caused by this burst of brain activity in a dying brain, why aren't people in all different cultures having a panoramic life review? Or are we supposed to believe that the same burst of brain activity causes a panoramic life review in certain Western people at certain times, but it only causes a sort of minor, slightly introspective thing on behalf of the community in other societies? So it's like, it goes back to the eternal question for me of what is cultural and what is universal about these experiences. And I think that's, so far, that's, despite research in NDEs, formal modern research since 1975, that question hasn't been resolved.
Well, it's interesting you bring up life reviews with regards to memory as well, because the kind of role of memory in the ancient Greek conception of the goddess, at least, is this idea of remembering the divine origins and roots of a human being. So it's not so much about remembering the past or remembering things that have happened. It is about rejoining the cosmic consciousness, in a sense. Like, it's Mnemosyne is the daughter of heaven and earth, so she is the product of the heavens and the earth coming together, and she is the mother of all muses, so she is the source of all inspiration in the world as well. And you know, to me, she's a kind of really good candidate for the goddess of lucid dreaming in a sense, because she is the goddess of the kind of ecstasy and the inspiration that you can receive in dreams. And I think there's something sort of similar in the NDE experience in terms of how people often have quite ecstatic experiences where they no longer are afraid of death and they feel like they are merging and one with the universe, and there's this sense of returning home somehow. So I think that it's quite an interesting thing to consider, that memory in terms of ancient perceptions of it isn't necessarily about remembering the past, but also potentially remembering the true nature of reality. And a bit like our concepts of divination and prophecy now tend to revolve around predicting or knowing things that are going to happen in the future, ancient ideas of prophecy are about also revealing of the truth and seeing the truth, which I think is much closer to the experience of an NDE and a divine lucid dream as well.
Yeah, I think that's all absolutely right. Yeah, and in fact, I think that understanding or remembering that the self is divine is such a key concept in afterlife beliefs in all different parts of the ancient world. So I'm sure I talked about this in the other talk that we had, but in the coffin texts in ancient Egypt, there's a very clear description of the soul of the deceased goes into a very particular area of the underworld called Rosatau, and there he finds the corpse of Osiris, which is lying there rotting. And the text says that the soul of the dead, the instruction is essentially to understand and realize and remember that you are Osiris, that you are one and the same with that God who's lying there rotting. They keep referring to the efflux of Osiris, which is a really disgusting description of it. It's basically the fluids of his corpse leaking out all over the tomb area. And so the intention of that, and again, the text explicitly states this, that the person who recognizes that they are one and the same with this corpse of Osiris, that realization enables them to progress and move on beyond that point and to access, the more positive realms of the afterlife and join Re, the sun god, and the circuit into the celestial realms and all that. So so I think that corpse is the kind of symbol of during a near-death experience, how the person has an out-of-body experience and sees their corpse lying there below. And it's that understanding of, oh shit, there's my body lying there, but I'm seeing it from this vantage point. I must be dead. I must be outside of my body, and therefore I must have survived my own death. And it's that realization that is, the tipping point, the transformative point of somebody who has an NDE, who realizes that, everything basically, and that especially for people who don't believe anything, for atheists, I don't want to say don't believe anything, but don't believe anything about the afterlife. To have that experience is, you've got to be life-changing, transformational thing, even more than for somebody who actually believes it.
Do you think ancient people were perhaps more likely to have out-of-body types of experiences and therefore be more familiar with the idea that the soul leaves the body? Because in a lot of ancient cultures, you have this idea. I know we had Vasilis Adratas, who specializes in indigenous Australian beliefs, recently, and he was saying that within native Australian culture, it's fairly commonplace to believe that the soul leaves the body when you're dreaming, and the waking up period and the falling asleep period is very risky because you could die if anything untoward happens to you in that phase. So do you think that suggests that out-of-body experiences are more common, or were more common in ancient times?
Were they more common in ancient times? I think they're actually the most common, one of the most common features of like near-death experiences now. And I think there's good evidence to say, not to reduce it neurologically, but there is a lot of evidence, more so than for other features of the near-death experience, that it can be linked to certain brain activity, like related to the temporal parietal junction and stuff. So hence it being quite universal. But then, yeah, maybe there's an interactive thing. Like for instance, when you talk about this a lot, Sarah, about like the NDE maybe akin, or the OBE as well, being maybe akin to like a waking dream thing, and there might be a suggestive effect where like you're asleep and you're in your bed and you wake up but in an OBE type state, and you see your body, because that's the kind of model of your previous circumstance you've just had in your mind. So maybe expectation effects, yeah, if it's more common culturally to talk about that maybe they're more common or profound or something.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely NDEs are more likely to happen, in contemporary modern cultures because we have the resuscitation technology. But in ancient societies, maybe there was a more open willingness to enter those kinds of states of mind than there is now, possibly.
Well, people probably got bored, didn't they, and went out of body more often, like
Yeah.
less stuff to do or less Netflix series to watch, etc.
Yeah.
David Luke asked, on the subject of gurus, what do you make of the idea of John the Baptist inducing NDEs by drowning people?
Wow.
I remember reading
John
about
Drowner. There's a Sheldrakean
John the
idea,
Drowner. Well, it's the idea that baptism was actually a way of inducing near-death experiences. Oh, Rupert Sheldrake, that was it, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
But I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this, actually, Gregory, because the one way in which I interpreted that, if you were to kind of entertain that, is, and you alluded to it earlier as well, about NDEs being kind of leveraged as a driver of religious revitalization movement. So when there's like oppressive political, cultural activity happening, like that was happening at the time of John the Baptist and Jesus, with the Romans, etc., and the oppression of that kind of political cultural milieu that was going on there, because the whole point of Jesus was that he was he was the Messiah, that there would be some kind of uprising and taking of the Jewish rights against the Romans, etc. So would that be consistent, you think, with maybe the deliberate induction of near-death experiences to bring this about?
I don't know that there's any evidence for that, but speculatively it seems reasonable. But I mean, Christianity is difficult and weird because, once the Council of Nicaea and the church got a hold of everything and suppressed so much, I think a lot probably changed. And to me, the really puzzling thing about Christianity is that, the entire religion is based on the death and rebirth of Jesus, essentially. But other than an apocryphal text about him descending into hell and freeing some of the souls there, we don't know much about what happened when he died, what his consciousness was doing from the time he died and came back to life. So I do kind of wonder if there's, we know that Christianity as it's practiced and understood today is very different than it would have been in Jesus's own time. But I also wonder if there's a huge NDE element of the religion that has been lost. And it's also true, to look at him in the context. I know it's kind of an outmoded way of thinking for a lot of scholars, the idea of the dying and rising God in the ancient Mediterranean. But phenomenologically, he was in a wider Mediterranean cultural complex of gods that died and came back to life. So I think the importance of that has become just the fact that he died and came back, rather than the fact that he died and had a near-death experience and came back. It's his spiritual experiences that have been neglected. And I think my speculation is that the way Christianity is now understood and practiced is that the only way to God and heaven and a positive afterlife is through Jesus. You have to, commit to believing in Jesus. Whereas a near-death experience gives you direct access, and that proves that you don't need to believe in Jesus in order to have a positive afterlife. And that's partly why it's so popular, and the NDEs are kind of significant to Mormons because they're very much of the mind frame that miraculous events like that can still happen and that they can happen to anybody. So they quite embrace NDEs, even though they're Christians of a sort.
It's interesting you mentioned these sorts of experiences happening during ages of anxiety, because that's one of Kasia Zapikowska's areas that she's researching at the moment. And so she's trying to track when there were particular sort of episodes in Egyptian history of political unrest or real difficulty, famine, whatever, and how that tracks with dream accounts, which I think is something we can do comparatively now. With there was a lot of interest in dreams happening during the COVID pandemic.
Right.
And so that's an interesting way to look at it. And we've also had Charles Stewart do a session for us. And he was researching dreams that were occurring in response to political issues in Greece, in island Greece, and how villagers started to have experiences of the Virgin Mary coming to them and revealing the location of buried icons and this kind of thing. And that's something that does track, like, with history, and when societies are going through particularly difficult times, people start having these dreams that are perhaps wish fulfillment, escapism, like, you know, trying to come up with solutions. And Danny Nemu just mentioned that with regards to actual stress increases certain endogenous chemicals, which may actually influence your dream content as well. So if people are experiencing a lot of stress, then they're more likely to have weird dreams, potentially. What else did he say? Oh, and David Luke also mentioned that apparently the OBE is not the feature of the NDE that leads to the greatest reduction of fear in people, which is quite interesting. And he said he found that surprising as well. Pascal, maybe that's a question to ask you. If it's not the OBE aspect of an NDE that makes people feel so brilliant, what is it?
Oh, brilliant. Well, that was an interesting finding, but that specific, you know, it's always methodological differences between studies and stuff, but that was just looking at how it affects fear of death, which is an important thing to research, because out of the slew of like potential transformative things happen in near-death experiences, that is pretty much, and for kind of obvious reasons, the maybe more ubiquitous one is less fear of death. But yeah, so as to why that is, like, what about the experience leads to that? So that one study found that OBEs weren't like significantly predictive of less fear of death, but there was a study by Bruce Grayson and some other colleague of his recently published, earlier, like last year, showing that it was and I sent this to you, Dave, recently, so I don't know if you have a better recall of the actual results, but actually it was entities meeting like divine mystical beings, which was one of the two most predictive things, which meant that they were less fearful of death. But you know, but these are like large, like quantitative things, and I think it's also interesting to acknowledge that people have, you know, on the phenomenological level, people have different experiences. Like they will say in much, you know, richer language themselves, in more like kind of personal ways, that certain elements of the experience were what transformed them, and so it'll be different between people.
David, do you want to chip in?
Only that kind of somewhat synchronistically, I've got a master's thesis which I need to mark tonight for the deadline tomorrow, where one of my students actually looked at which features of the near-death experience best predict reductions in fear of death.
And what are they?
I haven't had a chance to look at it because I've come to this talk, so I could tell you what my latest data on that is, but I'd sooner be in here than marking theses, I'm afraid.
I mean, I would speculate that it was just so many people come back and say it was an amazing experience. I felt overwhelming love. I felt at peace. I didn't want to come back. So it might just be sort of general things like that. Just it was great. It was a great feeling to be there.
Exactly, because that hands into the general deep existential anxiety that most like this kind of culture tends to have, that there's something to fear about it, something wrong about it, something unnatural, like, you know, what dreams may come once you reshuffle off this mortal coil kind of thing. And so if you then do shuffle off this mortal coil temporarily and it's pure bliss, then I think that's going to be pretty predictive of no longer caring about the
Can I jump in with a question? I'm sorry, I'm not officially on this panel or anything, but I mean, there is a big corollary in you know, the use of psychedelics in treating people who have end of life existential fear, and they have these kind of profound psilocybin or psychedelic induced mystical experiences, and it reduces their fear of death, and then they're better able to cope and less depressed and anxious and all the rest of it. And in a way, you know, it's very closely resembles what happens spontaneously when you have a near death experience. And I was wondering if you've familiar, Gregory, with this book, The Immortality Key, by Brian Ramsey. Thank you. Who's kind of looking into the whole origins of the origins of Christianity and the pagan continuity hypothesis, and that basically the Christianity was born out of these pagan funerary beer rites of taking hallucinogenic beverages and communicating with the dead. Just and supposedly this whole adage of, if you die before you die, then you don't die when you do die.
Right. Sounds like a Shawadi song.
Yeah, and if you think about, yeah, Princess Diana, did Dodie die or did Di die? You just keep going with this all day, really. Sorry. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but I wonder what you thought of that.
Yeah, I haven't read the book. I think it is on my reading list, actually. But yeah, I think that's, I don't know, I would hesitate to say that you know, it's just a matter of Christianity having nicked it from these other religions, but I see it all as part of the whole same cultural complex, and Christianity probably just, you know, it started as another cult from within that context, and it just happened to focus on a living prophet rather than on a god that's been dead for however many years, thousands of years, who may have been a real person. I mean, there's all these beliefs that Orpheus was a real person and all that. But yeah, I think there's definitely some pretty clear similarities between, you know, ancient mystery cults and some Christian practices and things like that, and conceptual similarities too.
Well, how do you think that? I mean, we've sort of alluded to some of this before, but when do you think the NDE might sit within that? So like Marescu's, well, he's sort of developing more like technical evidence and stuff like that, but it's from Carl Rock and like others who are doing it beforehand about like there's the Oscillian the mysteries at Lessus were psychedelic, and then that could have, you know, a certain sequence of events, things, and informed development of like Christianity, like the Eucharist, for instance. And so, but if you've got this kind of wider sort of paradigm of the NDE as kind of a primary experience, which then informs shamanic practices and rituals, where mystery cults would be like within that same sort of domain. But then, yes, so there's that. There's like NDEs being a presaging thing to a leftist baby, and then you're also sort of mentioning before about the kind of sympathetic magic thing, and maybe if you wanted to go in that direction. But yeah, how might you like reconcile that?
I think it's a question of I think replication of the primary experience. So just looking at like Native American religious revitalization movements like the Ghost Dance or the Dreamer religion and Indian Shaker Church, these were all basically founded on the near-death experience of the respective prophet. And again, in face of you know, cultural threat and religious persecution and cultural persecution. But so they have the near-death experience in common, but then they also have in common the practice of the adherence to the new religion, trying to achieve that same state through different kinds of shamanic practices. So so I think with the case of Christianity, it was probably that people's consciousness were already primed for the idea that somebody could die and come back to life. And within that wider Mediterranean world, where you've got various gods, from Osiris, going way back to Gilgamesh, and all these other gods in ancient Greece coming back, dying, coming back to life, then they were kind of culturally primed for Jesus dying and coming back to life. Therefore, he must be a god. Is, I think, maybe the way it played out.
The tradition in the Asclepian sanctuaries as well, of Asclepius being really just so similar to Jesus, being a miracle worker and healer, and his patients traveling to the underworld, their sick self dying and their healthy self being reborn to the world. So that was probably quite embedded in the culture of the time, and inspired such a kind of attack on the Asclepian sanctuaries as well, because Asclepius was such a threat to the cult of Jesus in the beginning.
Didn't Asclepius also, he supposedly not only healed people, he actually brought somebody back from the dead, and Hades got a bit bugged out by it, because he was kind of stepping on his toes and commanded that Zeus kill him, and then of course he'd become deified. But so he was killed for bringing somebody back from the dead.
Yeah, I've spoken to a few different people about that, and there's different ideas. I've spoken to recently like a classicist who spent a lot of time here, and he was saying that the reputation of Asclepius bringing someone back from the dead was probably due to the fact that he was a the powers of physicians at the time, like they did have anesthetics, like general anesthetics, and so it would appear to people, if someone was brought out of general anesthetic, that they would be brought back to life. And that because like there are like anesthetic herbs and substances that were used in medicine from the ancient Near East and into ancient Greece, definitely, like general anesthetic could have been practiced at those temples as well. And some of the ideas about those accounts that are kind of called dreams may be visions or kind of disorientating hallucinations that people saw when they were coming round from anesthetic, and that sacred sleep, the enkoimesis, could actually be like anesthetized sleep,
more of a visionary shamanic type experience than just a regular dream.
I think it's probably a mix of those things, because if you've got people used to this idea that you're going to have a dream encounter with a god, then there's going to be a blend of experiences. There'll be some people, maybe they just got a bit of a headache, they don't need to be put under general anesthetic, and they have a dream visitation with the god, and that's sufficient for them to feel a lot better when they come around from it. And then other people that might need a broken leg fixed, for example, or apparently there was even sex change operations that took place in the Asclepian sanctuaries.
Amazing. And I guess if they don't have the dreams, then you give them the anesthetics, right?
Well, I think like fumigating opium would have been pretty good. They used mandrake, henbane, all sorts of stuff. Like they were pretty.
That's a waking dream.
A decent waking dream.
But I guess, just going back to Pascal's question, in a way, Christianity, unless Rupert Sheldrake's correct that baptism was a form of inducing an NDE through almost drowning, it's kind of an outlier in that there was not really any kind of shamanic replicability of Jesus's death and return. I guess there's a promise of it far in the future with the resurrection or whatever, but it's as far as regular practice goes. It's interesting why.
Well, that's Mereskew's thesis, basically, that the early Christian, particularly the Greek practices, were making use of hallucinogens,
right?
And then it became suppressed from after Nicaea, in that, and also that it was women that were administering these kind of psychoactive beverages, beers and wines, and so that was kind of a double whammy for the Vatican, and they wanted to both suppress this kind of idea of the old state associations with earlier paganism and practices, and also the idea of the empowerment of the women who were administering them as well.
Right.
It's a fascinating, actually.
Yeah, I'll go check it out. I mean, I remember reading a book by John Allegro a long time ago, Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
Yeah, that was a bit more powerful.
yeah. And apparently that's been fairly well discredited. So I'd be curious to know a modern take on the similar thesis.
Yeah, it isn't as bold as Allegro's claim,
Right.
I mean, he basically said Jesus was a mushroom, but
yeah.
Morescu's a bit more cautious
Right.
and scholarly, I think, in his approach.
Okay.
I think he was just here in Greece, wasn't he? Rupert Sheldrake told me he was doing some big event around Alephsis, and I've seen that there's been various stuff going on while I've been here.
Yeah, Carl Ruck, I just chatted to Amanda Fielding today. They're all at Alephsis just recently.
Doing what?
Magic
Just Ruck giving them the kind of the deep down mystery tour of the rites of Eleusis, I think.
Practical workshop.
Yeah.
Nice.
But I'm interesting though. So the Eleusinian mysteries. I mean, if we don't know for certain if it was anything psychoactive going on there, but in a way you can see it as an attempt, perhaps even just through the theatre, of inducing a kind of near-death experience, in that they were going on a journey into the underworld in many respects, and they supposedly came out believing in immortality. So I guess you can see the Eleusinian mysteries in a way as a nod towards attempts to induce a near-death experience. What do you think of that, Gregory?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yeah, not to induce an actual one, but to with the sympathetic magic thing, it is kind of a performative near-death experience in a way, in order to bring about the effects of the experience without having to compromise your well-being.
That's I love the sympathetic magic link, and the magical element is really interesting, like anthropologically and stuff. But there could be some like neural elements to that. Like, I like this idea of state-dependent memory, where if, for instance, they were trying to cultivate, and they had all this highly fine-tuned, like curated environment, and the theatrical progression through the Eleusinian mysteries and everything, and to curate like a positive experience. Well, the point of it's going through the underworld, and so like a shadow confrontation, like challenging, like dark experiences and things, but then ultimately it's like this beatific visionary thing, and like revelatory thing at the end, and so you're saying the sympathetic magic thing sort of takes advantage of that to actually have some kind of impact in a kind of magical way on one's death experience, for like the purpose of engendering like a favorable death experience. But also, like, the brain, if you kind of condition the brain, if we're saying, like, my whole doctorate was about like the comparability between psychedelics and near-death experiences, if you're kind of conditioning the brain through these mysteries of a particularly positive near-death like psychedelic state, and then ultimately we do die, brain regresses into a similar state, then it's in this what's referred to as like a state-dependent memory process. It's going to be more likely that you'll flash back to that positive experience, and then have a great trip when you die, basically.
Yeah, that ties in with what Sarah was saying about memory. I think that the key thing to remember is dying consciously, and dying in that state of awareness where you know what to expect, and therefore you can I guess reap the benefits of the experience rather than let it overwhelm you, and which is also similar to lucid dreaming. If you can be aware that it's happening, then you can participate in it rather than,
and you can make it positive, you can make it good.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I would say about the mysteries of Alephsis, and being, because I've recently been there as well, And my sense always being there is this feeling that it's really about the cycles of nature. It's all about the fact that when we die, like when plants die, we go through a cycle of decomposition and rebirth. And the first time I went to Alephsis was at springtime, when all the spring flowers were out. And I'm very much into spring and very much into the kind of ecstasy that you can feel in spring. And I think that modern human beings are a bit removed from how ecstatic spring must have felt to ancient people. But especially during lockdown, going to the Bluebell Woods, or being, you know, coming out of winter and seeing all the spring flowers, like I can get into quite a heightened state of consciousness. And being at Alephsis during spring, when all the spring flowers were out, I got this real sense that, you know, it's all about Demeter and Persephone. It's all about the fact that everything seems to die. There's less food available. There's less color and life and beauty. And then when spring comes again, everyone is reborn. So it's this kind of collective experience of dying with plants and being reborn with plants in the springtime. Like, it really feels like there's this strong relationship and understanding that we're all part of this kind of natural tapestry. And so dying is never going to be the end, because everything is reborn eventually. Danny, you've got your finger up.
Yeah, I couldn't work out how to press the button.
It's not the middle one.
Yeah, I lived in Japan, and they have a party called Hanami, which is at the beginning of spring, and it's when you kind of come out of winter. Everyone's been sitting around in their freezing cold houses, and then it's when all the cherry blossoms go off, and everyone goes and has picnics under the cherry blossoms and gets drunk, and it's amazing. And there's a real vibe in the air. And I gave something to a friend of mine who I bumped into at a party, and he flung it in the air. And it turned out he was having this florid maniac experience. And another friend of ours ended up taking him to hospital. And she said the walls were just bouncing with people, because all of the mania just comes exploding out in this explosion of pink and spring. And yeah, it's a real interesting vibe. But yeah,
well, it's called the Alephsis. The mysteries of Alephsis were called the sacred orgies, because it's orgiastic. Like, spring is orgiastic.
Yeah, so that's how your Hanami party is meant to end up. You're meant to come out and you're meant to get laid at least. I don't know if you get into an orgy.
What time of year is this, Danny?
This was around April. I think it might be changing now.
David Luke is not going to mark that essay. He's just going to book his flight to Japan.
But I wanted to respond to something else as well, which was about about any kind of psychedelic aspect of the kind of Jesus mysteries. And he's the Christ, and his name comes from chrism, and the chrism is the anointing, and the anointing oil which he was using is super psychedelic. Like, it's got I won't talk about this for too long, but it's got 4 ingredients in it, one of which is almost certainly cannabis, one is myrrh, and the other 2 are cinnamon and cassia. It's all in Exodus 30, and the combination of cinnamon and cassia together works to inhibit your enzymes and open up all of the opioid potentials of myrrh, and then whatever else happens to be going on at the time, and obviously potentially in the cannabis as well. So I think that there's I'm certain of it. That was used by the priests, and it was used by the kings in the Old Testament. When it comes through down to Christ, he starts putting it onto his apostles in the apocryphal Gospels, and then they go out and he says to them, go out and anoint the sick, which was a kind of democratization of what had been part of the priestly technologies of contacting Yahweh through psychedelic means. Yeah. So without going into it too much, I have banged an article up in the chat called "Getting High with the Most High."
Brilliantly written, well worth a read. Gregory, can I have a question? Is he still there? I can't see him. You alluded to this eternal debate since the mid-70s of the study of NDEs, of trying to discern what is a kind of universal and what's a cultural as regard to NDEs. I'd love to hear what your own particular opinion on what those different factors are.
Yeah, I think that each one of the elements of an NDE is just much more thematic and symbolic than has been hitherto recognized. I mean, I think things like the grace in the scale and these near-death experience scales where they have a point system, and if the person has experienced a certain number of these sub-experiences, then that qualifies as an NDE. I think it's useful, but they, for one thing, things like the life review are not really applicable as much cross-culturally. So I think, as Pascal was saying, if we look at them just as the thematic idea that this is a transformative experience that in which somebody has a kind of introspective moment during the experience where they want to help the community when they come back from the experience, that sort of thing is possibly more useful. But the way I've avoided it, maybe it's a cop-out, but I've just rather than me determining what a near-death experience is according to its phenomenology, I just determine it by its context. So if somebody claims to have died, or if their community claims that they died and came back to life, if their consciousness had experiences in that interim, then I consider it an NDE, regardless of what they said. If they saw Barbies riding unicorns, then that would count.
That'd be fascinating. That might well appear quite soon.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, actually.
Okay, thank you for that.
But having said that, I think there are fairly common, just very generally, like entering darkness and coming out into light, or seeing a being of light, reducing the darkness to a tunnel. I think that's when you start getting into the more debatable kinds of constructions about what the experiences are.
Fantastic.
Actually, I don't want to steal the mic because there are people with hands up, but I think that does lead nicely into talk about dreams and the whole collective dream thing, Gregory. So I would like to get onto that, but Mary has a hand up if you want to say something, Mary.
Yeah, I don't want to go off topic. Sorry, I had to leave for a few minutes before I could come back. But there seems to me an interesting sort of, I don't know if phenomenology is the word, the increase in neonatal care units and the number of babies' lives that are being saved, and the increase in drug overdoses, 20 years later down the road in these people's lives. I want to quote somebody, but I know she's not very academic. PMH Atwater talks about the craving of going back and having another near-death experience because it's so impactful. And I know you talked earlier about coming back as a better person. And I just want to share something because I'm personally connected to this thing that I'm talking about, and I don't know if there's a trend or not. But when I gave birth to my first child, he did end up in a neonatal center for about 10 days. And so it was touch and go for a while. And I've asked, I think this baby had a near-death experience, but how do we ask a baby? Because, most children that have really wild experiences lose touch after that, or their ability to talk about it, their memory of it, by age 7. But my son did talk about it at age 2.5. And it was wild. And I'll try to be brief. The first one is he talks about how he sat on the shoulder of God, and God gave him a choice to come back or to stay. And he decided that my husband and I look like decent people, like nice people. So he decided to come. Very 2.5-year-old language. But the other thing he said to me, and it was a couple of months after this point, which just blew my mind and made me a convert. He said to me, Mama, did you know we keep dying and getting reborn until we get it right? Out of the blue, he was playing with a matchbox car on the floor and just looked up, almost like he was channeling something else. And I'm looking around to see if there's any other adults in the room that can hear this, because it's just mind blowing. And he didn't say anything else. I tried to ask him more, and he was done. It was like that channel just closed up. And I asked him about it again later and later. Like in his teen years and into his 20s, 30s, and he has no memory of that happening. I know it happened, and so I was curious, because he did have what I would consider a near-death experience as a baby. And getting back to the PMH Atwater thing, he did become very experimental with drugs, almost like he wanted to return back to that place. And, I have a healthy relationship with him. I don't want him to go again, but there's something about having an experience like that that really just sort of changed my mind about what is this existence and what's going on. And I would love to know if there are broader studies about any kind of connections with, the advent of modern technology saving lives, and maybe the current trend in young adults overdosing. I don't know. That was a lot. Sorry.
Wow,
No,
that
that's
was
really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how I've never heard of a study like that. I don't know how they would formulate it, because you could just say the fact that more lives are being saved would mean that there's more people who are going to do drugs and overdose anyway. But to find that correlation would be difficult. But it's a fascinating idea. And so did your son have any memories of a previous personality, like actual past life?
Right. Yeah. No. And I looked for it. I tried to see if there was anything like that going on. Interestingly enough, he decided to study religion at university. So I think that there's this, and he is the kindest human being. I mean, I hate to rate him over my other children, but even the other kids in the family say he's the nicest one in our whole family. And so it's almost like he did come back a better person, but like 10 days later, which kind of is bizarre. And he's highly spiritual. He tends more naturally to sort of a Buddhist faith. And we raised him Christian, specifically Catholic. All of us have fallen away from that, by the way, and lean more towards his belief systems. But no, he hasn't expressed another personality. And I wish like maybe he could go under hypnosis or something. And
Danny, there's a job for you.
What's that?
Well, Danny did a hypnosis session recently, so maybe that's for you, Danny. Have you ever done past life regression?
Yeah, I have done. I've only really done it by mistake. I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, so I'm always a little bit cautious when I'm going to past lives. But I've never really pursued it on purpose. But I do some timeline stuff where you're looking for some kind of a trauma. I remember I had this woman who had migraines, and I ended up doing timeline stuff, and we went back, kind of going back through her life and through her childhood. She was above her body, looking at these various incarnations or various ages of herself. And then I said, is it something that happened after you were born? And she went, no. And occasionally they will do that, like maybe one in, I don't know, 5 or 6 or something would say that. And then I say, was it something that happened after you were conceived? And went through her 9 months of gestation, and it was like no. And I was like, oh wow, I've got a past life on. And then we went to a past life where she was clobbered over the head with a stick, and she had a headache. I have actually had a past life regression myself, which was quite interesting.
What happened?
I don't know. I really don't know. Again, it's like I don't know if I believe in yesterday or today, and kind of trying to work out this whole thing about past lives, and I find it very confusing. And but my past life did pertain to the problem that I'd brought to the practitioner. I hadn't told her it was a lung thing, but it was about drowning. I was and the fact that I was about to go to Brazil to go to the Amazon, and there was an indigenous aspect to it. I hadn't told her anything about that, but that's where I ended up. And I was an extremely heroic Amazonian indigenous person, which I really liked. I don't know if it was true, but it was definitely a story which cast light on the current situation, which is what all stories are, and perhaps what all lives are, including these ones. Yeah, but we can go there. I can do past life stuff. I guess one of the things that I'm a bit wary about, I actually got asked the other day to do a regression into this life, because somebody got in touch with me and they said, someone gave somebody else £20,000 and they both wrote it down, and now one of them is saying they didn't. Can you help? No, not really, because one of the things you do find with
in Hastings, because it sounds like a Hastings situation.
I think they're in Brighton, which is more unlikely. But yeah, I was like, did you write it on the same bit of paper? No, they both wrote it, and the whole thing is really sketchy. But anyway, I'm not doing it because in some of the kind of regression stuff, and this is this life regression, you had it with the kind of satanic ritual abuse of children, where people who just simply hadn't been abused were coming forward and saying that they had, and it was, and also sexual abuse, just normal non-satanic sexual abuse of children. The stuff that's going on, memory is called remember for a reason, because we put stuff that's in our head back together into something which is, it may symbolically mean everything, but it might not actually be a certain thing. That's even in these lives. So yes, to answer the question, I have done past lives. I've done it myself. I've done it on other people, and it is meaningful. But whether it's actually a past life, I'm maybe, but I'm not sure.
Great. Thanks, Danny.
It's a fascinating story, though. I had a friend who showed me once some pictures. She looked like an alien. She even had pointy ears, and she was really weird. I was completely fascinated by this woman. This was when I was at university, and she showed me pictures of when she was really little, of these drawings that she did of like spaceships. When she was super young, and her mum had said she'd said some really strange things about coming off spaceships and stuff like that. So there's definitely material that does come through into very young people's psyche and communication, which clearly doesn't come from here. What it means is a whole other question.
Yeah, there's some really interesting cases of children who remember past lives, who also remember their previous death and rebirth into their new life. So, which is essentially the same state that a near-death experience would be. So it's kind of what you were saying, Mary Beth, except they also remembered their past life personality. So there was one famous case of a little boy named Katsugoro in 19th century Japan, and he remembered very vividly leaving his body, seeing his own funeral, and then going to the other world and encountering some deity who I can't remember if he was given a choice to come back or not, or if he was just told that he was going to be coming back. But yeah, there's quite a few of them. There's a famous Indian case as well that Gandhi got interested in, and I can't remember her name, but it was one of the ones where she had very specific memories about her previous existence, and she was able to like give directions on a road of how to get to her former house and recognize people that, relatives and friends that she had known in her previous life. But she also had memories of the intermediate state, where some Hindu saints had greeted her and took her to see Krishna and various other things. And then she remembered seeing her parents and being reborn into this specific family. But as far as just an NDE without an associated past life memory goes, I don't know if I've heard of one that's quite that young, though.
Yeah, that what you're talking about reminds me of Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. Yeah,
he researched some of those. In fact, both of those cases, he reevaluated the Katsugoro case and the other one as well.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else got any questions? Gregory, what led you to research near-death experiences in the first instance?
I kind of don't really know, other than just that they're really interesting. And I guess what kind of started it off, though, was I had read the book Other World Journeys by Carol Zaleski, which is about medieval accounts of mostly monks and nuns who have NDE-like experiences. And she looked at them in relation to NDEs and came to an ultimately negative conclusion about them. She basically said that it's a different phenomenon and they were just all literary inventions and whatever. But to me, it sort of fired up my imagination. And I thought, like, if there are these accounts from medieval Europe, then where else might they be? And but that was just kind of filed away. You know, I just kind of read that for fun. And then when I was doing my Egyptology degree, I was you know, reading afterlife texts, coffin texts, and pyramid texts and everything, and it just kind of started feeling like this is kind of familiar. This seems, you could kind of transpose this onto near-death experience and it would make sense in a whole different way. And then it just started wondering where else that might be applicable, and did a comparison with India and Egypt, and then it just snowballed from there. But I haven't had one myself or anything. I have had lucid dreams, and I've had, you know, psychedelic experiences, and part of me maybe intuitively feels like it's a similar kind of state of being, and that might just be because those are the only states that I know that are non-ordinary, you know, or meditational states occasionally that not as profound as like a lucid dream or psychedelics, but yeah. So you know, they talk about intuitive dualism as well, that we just kind of, even if we're not religious and even if we're rabidly atheistic, we talk about the world and experience the world as if we are somehow separate from our bodies, as if our consciousness and ourselves are somehow not just the body. It's kind of built into the language. I kind of feel like that about NDEs in some ways, and as far as dream states and psychedelic states go.
And does your research lead you to any ideas about the afterlife? Do you believe in an afterlife?
I don't disbelieve in one, but I don't believe in one either. I kind of think, like, I mean, the veridical stuff that happens in NDEs are pretty amazing. The accounts of, I think especially what they call Pekindarian experiences, where somebody dies and encounters the soul of somebody else in the afterlife, and it's somebody they didn't know had died, and then they come back to life and they're told, oh, what a coincidence, Aunt Margie died yesterday or whatever, and you just happen to see her in the other world. I don't see how that could possibly be explained any other way than an actual, you know, out-of-body afterlife experience, or complete fabrication. But it seems like there's some kind of evidence for those. But I also think that aside from that, what happens after the near-death experience phase, at the point at which people come back, when they reach the barrier and wake up, or they're told by the being of light or whatever that it's not your time to die, we don't have any way of knowing what's happening in that state, if anything. And it could be that we survive for the near-death experience stage, and then we die after that. So yeah, I don't know.
There is that idea of the near-death experience being a kind of like survival mechanism in human beings to prevent them from, like, the shock and trauma killing them. It's like a way, you know, when Pascal was talking before about my ideas about near-death experiences and OBEs, like, I had a lot of false awakenings as a kid, and most of my false awakenings were in response to not wanting to get out of bed. So, I mean, it's not actually dying, there's nothing very risky, but I really didn't want to get out of bed. And so I would send my sort of soul out of my body to get dressed to go to school, and I would sometimes do it like 10 or 15 times, thinking that I was awake getting dressed. And when the body undergoes a lot of shock, like my brother had a very serious car accident, you can't cope with the amount of shock and pain that you're experiencing, so you kind of like pop out, a little bit like dissociative identity disorder, in a way, where you can't cope with the trauma that you experience as a kid or in an abusive situation, so you split off, part of you splits off in order to kind of compartmentalize where that trauma is taking place. So do you think there's an element of that with NDEs, whereby there's this kind of safety mechanism that occurs where we just want to get out from the trauma, so we project ourselves out of that place.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I'm kind of wary of like evolutionary theories around that, where they say that it's this response of a dying brain that's kind of rushing in to comfort you or give you the illusion of life and survival. Because I just wonder what would be the point of that at the moment of death if your brain knows that it's dying? Like, why does it matter if we're comforted or not at the moment of death? Or why would we create the illusion of survival?
Well, they're not all nice though, are they? I remember Pascal telling me about like a really horrible near-death experience where
that's true too.
Someone was, it was a really negative one. But I mean, that brings me on to another question I was going to ask you, Gregory, which is there anything you're doing in your life now to prepare yourself for a decent death, for a decent experience of entering the afterlife?
Good question.
That is a good question. I think, for one thing, all the work that I do and that I spend so much of my waking life thinking about death and the afterlife and near-death experiences is probably it. Like, if I don't have dreams about death or the afterlife, I have, but I don't regularly. And in meditation, I don't focus on any of the things that would facilitate a kind of conscious dying or anything like that. And I think maybe that's partly because I spend so much of my normal life doing it anyway. So yeah, I'm hoping that the academic work is, because there's such a crossover between academic work and spiritual work and life work, or whatever you want to call it. So it's all kind of intertwined, and I'm hoping that I've done enough of it that when I do die, I'll be able to say, okay, I know what this is. I know what's going on here.
You mentioned meditation there as well. And I think with meditation, quite often you cultivate this sense of awareness. And to me, like with lucid dreaming and with cultivating awareness within dreams, even when I was really small, I had this idea that if I can cultivate awareness in a dream, then I will be aware when I die. And therefore I can not necessarily control that experience, but be conscious of it and perhaps have a better experience of dying. And within those cultures where people are actively practicing like a good death, it is all about cultivating awareness and consciousness and entering death happily and peacefully. And I think, I often, when I do dream workshops, I think that how you fall asleep is often a big part of how positive or negative your dream is. And I think the same could probably be said of death, that if you are positive about dying, your experience of death is more likely to be positive. Just if you fall asleep worrying about stuff, you're more likely to have a bad dream.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And that's definitely borne out in NDEs as well. A good example of that is, you mentioned negative, distressing near-death experiences. Some of them are basically phenomenologically consistent with positive near-death experiences, but people experience them in a negative way. So the tunnel isn't exhilarating and exciting and going to a new place. It's this horrific, restricting darkness, and the being of light is this, threatening, judgmental thing. And instead of positive spirits and relatives that you meet that you'd love to see, it's like the sensation of demons pulling you down or whatever. So they have these kind of counterparts, but they're seen in a similar way. So I kind of wonder if it essentially is the same type of experience, but it's just depending on the person's psychological state. And maybe for most people, because you're freed of your limitations of your brain, of your waking state.
Yeah.
For most people, you're more open to the experience happening, but some people maybe cling to that fear. I don't know.
Well, it's very much like with psychedelic experiences. That's the point of set and setting. Sure. And even if you do, if you are having a psychedelic experience where your high inhibitive networks, or default mode network, are dismantled, and you have your mind more open, it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that you're just going to have a positive experience that lends itself to just greater intensity and complexity of a challenging experience. That's the point of the Tibetan book of the Tibetan practice as well, right? But it's a particularly interesting thing about that is like with suicide-induced NDEs, and it seems there's not like loads of literature about that, but Ken Ring and early studies showed that there wasn't necessarily more challenging experiences with suicide-related NDEs, but a more recent study and kind of better methodologically was like, of those NDEs which are challenging, a greater proportion of them are actually suicide related, because you're obviously, you that is the prototype of being in a horrible state, isn't it? Wanting to kill yourself, and then, yeah.
Can I just jump in with it's not really an evolutionary explanation. It's not only an evolutionary explanation. It's for the presence of DMT in the kind of death state. This is from Eddie Frexker, who's a Hungarian psychiatrist, quite a senior psychiatrist, and he discovered that DMT is anti-inflammatory and is produced in the lungs, I believe. And he was talking about how when your life is threatened, if you have a big car crash or something like that, then there would be a flood of DMT that comes out of your lungs, if I remember his theory correctly. I've put a link to it in the notes there. And it would reduce inflammation and potentially help with any kind of clotting if it managed to keep you, and in which case it might manage to keep you alive. And if it didn't manage to keep you alive, it would send you off in quite an interesting state.
You'd have a bloody good time trying, basically.
Yeah, even more bloody, seeing as it was anti-inflammatory.
Yeah, I'm kind of more willing to accept that type of theory if we don't have to go to explain why. You know, like if people aren't saying it's an evolutionary thing, but if it's just that's what happens when you die. And I think as far as whether there's really an afterlife as well, I kind of look at it that way, that it's not necessarily having to do with some supernatural or religious divine thing. It's just what happens when, just as, I don't know, to use a corny analogy of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, it's maybe that's just what happens with humans when we die. We just enter this other dimension. It doesn't have to be, spiritual or religious or supernatural.
I think I heard an evolutionary theory of an afterlife once, which was, I think it was about, I'm trying to remember it exactly, but it was ancestors continue to influence your life would be an evolutionary advantage if they could kind of nudge you away from danger, or, tell you someone was creeping up on you or something like that.
Well, that's like
but instead we have intergenerational trauma. Sorry, go ahead, Pascal.
Sorry, what I missed. We missed each other. What did you say?
I just made a dark joke that instead we have intergenerational trauma.
Oh, right. Not much funnier than what I said. I was just saying about that is, I mean, that's a super cool theory, Danny. But also there's kind of good, at least like anthropological, I don't know if you call it evidence, but like the use of entheogenic experiences and like with ayahuasca ancestor connection through altered states for the purpose of helping the community that are still alive, right?
I think that, I know it's a kind of flippant comment, but there is also an evolutionary argument on intergenerational trauma as well, because if terrible things have happened to you, it's probably quite good that you're anxious, that your children will be anxious because they might have to deal with terrible things as well,
Right.
Yeah. A bit less trusting.
Yeah.
Alfred Russel Wallace, he had a theory of evolution at the same time as Darwin, of course, but he also posited a kind of spiritual evolution. I wondered if he had any thoughts about afterlife evolution spiritually as well. I don't know, but he might be someone you could turn to for kind of spiritual evolution.
Yeah, because my feeling is it has to be just part of it, the natural process, and I don't think it's something that's going to be incompatible with everything else we know about the world.
Well, that comes back to the closer relationship that Indigenous people and ancient people had with natural cycles, because they would have recognized that nothing really dies. Like all plants and animals give birth to new generations, or the concept that we have of death and like overemphasis on the individual is like massively colors our view of death, which is why people are so terrified of dying now. Whereas I think that there was a greater appreciation for being part of a community and being part of a line of ancestors, and that some aspect of yourself is always woven into that fabric of the natural order, so that you don't have to be so utterly terrified of dying. And, you know, for me, that's what I think the mysteries of Alephsis, for example, are all about, is living and dying with the cycle of the seasons, and actually feeling yourself living and dying with the cycle of the seasons, because you have the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries, and they correspond with spring and autumn. And, you know, that times that have always been honored as being like the dying times and the rebirthing times.
Yeah, in that sense, I wonder if NDEs were seen as sort of symbolic of the mysteries rather than the other way around. You know, if they were adopted by the mysteries because of the thematic consistency with the death and rebirth and cycles of nature, rather than having any kind of foundational role in them.
Well, it must have been Jesus mysteries as well, because like you say, Jesus was a cult in the beginning. So there are just mysteries that have been lost because he's so similar to Osiris. And even the descent of Inanna, this idea that someone descends into the underworld and everything that they have is stripped away from them, and then they are reborn. So I mean, I'm sure there are Christian mysteries as well.
Yeah, and there's lots of Sumerian underworld myths with Dumuzi and people like that involve grain and cycles of nature, and so it's all intertwined there as well.
In the Near East as well, this idea that the great below, the underworld there, is somewhere where you go to find out the future. So it's this realm of revelation, or where the future is kind of gestating, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, we've gone on for ages. So, Dave, what do you want? What do you want?
I was just saying, I was just about to say I've got to go, but I've got to go and rejuvenate and die and rejuvenate. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks for coming, David. Good to see you.
One thing. I just really want to thank Gregory for examining Pascal's PhD. I haven't had a chance to see him and thank him. And
no worries.
I wish I'd been in there as a fly on the wall. Sounded brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
You weirdly happen to be here for the reversal kind of nature of it after all. Which is fantastic.
I think he's got his PhD. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think he's got it now. Yeah.
Oh, we're talking about you.
Oh, me. Well, maybe Pascal will be my examiner from the second one I'm doing.
PhD. Oh, yeah. That would be a turn of events. Let's make that happen, shall we?
Anyone have any last questions? Pascal, any last? Gregory?
Of course I do.
All right, Pascal.
But maybe we
jumping in the bit.
We should have some hiatus, and I mean, I would love to have another conversation with you, Gregory, at some other point in the future, and we can further hash out all the infinite threads that are yet to be hashed out about this topic.
Yeah, we didn't get onto the mind dependence afterlife stuff,
exactly.
But yeah.
So
Gregory, is Carlos awake yet?
I can go check if you want.
Oh, please. I mean, that would just be the cherry on the cake.
Okay.
Who's Carlos?
His dog. He's the cutest dog in the world. Like, I've never seen a happier dog. If there was ever a dog that exemplified someone who'd had a really good past life and came back as a really happy dog, it's Carlos. Oh, he's so cute.
A little bewildered looking.
Yeah, he's not looking as cheerful. I need to show him some sort of food. He looks quite cheerful. Oh, he winked at me.
You're wondering why the hell I just went and picked him up from his nap.
Oh, Carlos.
Yeah, look at him.
I'm in the land of cats at the moment, and I'm not a cat person. I just look at cats and think Toxoplasma gondii, whereas I look at a dog and I just think they're like angels.
Yeah, he's not crazy about them either. His nemesis.
That's true.
It looks very fox-like, actually. I love dogs which look like foxy with those kind of fox-like ears.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah, he does. He's a fox-like attitude and personality as well.
Yeah.
Oh.
Very mischievous.
It's lovely to see Carlos in real life. I always enjoy your Carlos photographs so much on Facebook. I can't
Oh,
tell
good.
you how much I get out of, like, he smiles, like he actually
Yeah.
smiles, like he looks so ecstatically happy. It's really cute.
He does, yeah. Now he's just spacey.
Yeah, he's not really into near-death experiences, is he? He's more into ice cream and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and just exploring and sniffing around everything, chasing the neighbor's cat.
Yeah, good job, Carlos. Well, thank you very much, everyone. That was a lovely end to a brilliant session. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming along. That was really great.
Thanks.
And Leslie, do you want to talk about our next one? What is our next? Oh, our next one tomorrow is Anthony Peake, who is going to be talking about cheating the ferryman and the myths within Greek culture of immortality. So that should be quite an interesting session. And then we have, carrying on with that theme, Janet P. Delato, who's going to do a dream incubation inspired by Chiron and the sort of myths of the ferryman as well. And then, are you there, Leslie? We've got UC Brightmore. Do you want to talk about UC's session? You're muted.
Yeah, UC is one of our artists in residence, so it's going to be one of the first practical social dreaming pieces that we do. I was just trying to find this paragraph about what the project is called. It's called Dream Share. And gosh, one second. I would rather read his words than paraphrase. It's an invitation to start sharing dreams for a sonic work of art that's going to be incubated during our residency and then performed at the symposium. And he's just sent me the text, so bear with me. Is that the next one after Anthony Peake?
No, it's not the next one. So Anthony Peake, Janet P. Delato, which is also a practical one, a dream incubation. Then we've got, I'm really excited, we've got Eric Wargo, who wrote Time Loops.
Oh, yeah.
He is going to be doing a workshop about precognitive dreaming and time loops, which should be very interesting. That's on the 14th. And then on the 15th, we have Eob Dorillo, who is a curator at the British Library, and he specializes in he's an Ethiopic collection curator, and he's fantastic. He's previously done a talk for Explorers Egyptology, and he's an expert on Ethiopian dreaming rituals and also the Tsar rituals. I don't know if you know about the Tsar, but that's a kind of sub-Saharan stroke Egyptian magical practice to they often have ecstatic rites that go on for days and nights to do with things like possession and stuff like this. So that's really interesting, kind of like living magical culture that's quite popular in Egypt at the moment even. So yeah, and then UC is on the 16th of October.
Yeah, so that's called Dream Share. It's a participatory audio artwork by UC Brightmore, who's a UX designer and musician. I won't go into all the bands he's been in, but he's a great musician. I've known him for a long time, which spans multiple phases across the Dream Palace program. Dream Share invites participants to contribute to an audio montage consisting of recordings in which participants describe their dreams. This piece evolves through ongoing participation and contribution over numerous communal dreaming workshops throughout the festival. It aims to explore how this evolving audio montage may further influence participants' dream content and investigates the possible outcomes of thematic feedback loops and/or progressive diversification on our dream landscapes. Dream Share will conclude in a music performance woven from the resulting audio montage recordings. Dream Share references an audio technique to sustain dream states that Brightmore developed intuitively as a teenager, and also the Dreams of 1964, an intervention for radio by Delia Derbyshire and Barry Burmage with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. These components are developed in the social context of the Dream Palace event with the aim of exploring how we potentially capture, combine, and extend the dream experience of Dream Palace participants. The first phase of Dream Share starts during the online residency and invites participants to share voice recordings describing their dreams in detail to the artist. These recordings will be compiled to form the initial iteration of the evolving audio montage that will underpin the subsequent in-person communal listening and dreaming workshops. So that's going to be one of the first social dreaming experiments that we are doing to start building the Dream Palace, because the idea is that we want to do practical things with the social dreaming as well.
Yeah, so if you have any good dreams, make audio recordings of them, because UC will be able to use them. And it's 10 days now until our event starts in Athens. So
yeah, and also bring those dreams to the meeting with UC on the 16th, because we'll be recording it anyway, and we'll have a discussion around that and let him contextualize the project himself. So that'll be exciting. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Pascal and Gregory, and everyone else for your excellent questions and comments.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Gregory, Danny, Dave, Leslie, Mary.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
You've got to do everyone now, Pascal. You start.
I can't see them all. Oh, Alex.
Christoph, Milda, Elena.
There we go.
There we go. All right.
I wish I could join you in Athens, but maybe next time.
Gregory, I wish you could. Next year. Come next year. Yeah. We can do some flogging corpses with snakes and see what happens.
Excellent. Yeah.
Is that an in-joke?
No, I'm curious as well. I'll see you all later.
All right. See you later.
Okay. Bye.
Are you mumbling, Pascal?
I was texting Dave.
Oh yeah. Oh, thanks. That was great. I thought that was marvelous.
It was. Because I actually forgot